but it's wonderful to be here on a Friday morning, afternoon, night for the ISRS, the International Society for Research on Solitude seminar series. This is the third in our series. We have a seminar roughly every 2 months. We were set up, appropriately enough, early in the lockdown in 2020, and we brought together a number of scholars for conferences, for publications, for a currently being proofread Bloomsbury Handbook of Solitude, Silence and Loneliness. There's a number of us all around the world in at least 5 continents joining together in this seminar. I am Julian Stern from Bishop Grosseteste University in Lincoln in the UK, president of the ISRS, and myself with Gosia Wojko and Rafa Iwański from the University of Szczecin are hosting this seminar series, and we are respectively president, vice president. Gosia is responsible for all the vice in the organisation, and secretary, as Rafa is, of the ISRS. And we'll be introducing, or say a little more about the ISRS before introducing Mandy to us all on Encounter, Communion and Revealing in Shepherd and Thoreau. Here is a picture of the current website of the ISRS. On that you will see near the right of the seminar, of the website pages, the recordings of the previous seminars in these series, and if Mandy is happy with it afterwards, a recording of this seminar will be uploaded there as well. It also has guidance on joining, which is free to join the association, and you will be mailed with information and so on just about the association. You can write to us, including during the seminar if there are technical problems. That will get through to Rafa at write.isrs@gmail.com. And that website is live and lively, has information about publications and so on. Please do join us on that. And so that's about it, I think. It is a huge pleasure to introduce Amanda Fulford, Professor of Philosophy of Education. I've known Mandy for several years now, when she was working at Leeds Trinity University and now at Edge Hill University in Ormskirk in the northwest of the UK. Mandy has one of the most I would call generous approaches to philosophy of education, both for drawing people into philosophy of education, rather than, as some philosophers of education sadly do, building walls around themselves to cut people off. Mandy is extremely generous, has a large number of doctoral students and people who would not think of themselves as philosophers of education, but joining with her in Philosophy of Education Society of Great Britain and other initiatives. Now not only running professional learning and developing research and professing in philosophy of education at Edge Hill, but also writing a lot on people like Stanley Cavell and on writing itself, on the process of writing, and significantly and regularly on Nan Shepherd and Henry David Thoreau. I always get him mixed up because he started off David Henry Thoreau and swapped his names around. So Nan Shepherd and Thoreau, wonderful writers on solitude, about whom Mandy has also written in the forthcoming, coming in December, Bloomsbury Handbook of Solitude, Silence and Loneliness. So I'm looking forward both to hearing what Mandy has to say and to hearing what we as a community want to discuss about that. So I will close this screen down and introduce Mandy. Welcome to us, welcome to this seminar, everybody. I need to work out how to unshare my screen.
Thank you very much, Julian, for that extremely warm and generous welcome, and also just for the invitation to be here with you this afternoon. It's so lovely to see people from all around the world. And thank you so much for giving up your time on a Friday, and what I'm sure for those of you in higher education is a very busy time of year with marking and graduating and preparing for a new academic year. So thank you so much for being here and for the invitation. It really is very much appreciated. So as Julian said, I've been writing a contribution to this wonderful Bloomsbury Handbook, which is going to come out in December, and I very much look forward to that. And I've written a chapter in there about solitude in nature, very much drawing, as Julian has said, on the work of Anna, or as she was known, Nan Shepherd, and Henry David Thoreau. And I think they are fascinating writers in a number of ways, because yes, they do write about the solitude, but I think they profoundly disturb some of the notions of solitude that we might have. So what I want to try and do today is to base this presentation on that chapter and draw out three things which I think really characterize and mark the way that both these writers, both these philosophers, I would very much argue that they're both philosophers, I want to draw out those characteristics which I think mark their understanding of solitude. And so hence the title, Encounter, Communion and Revealing. Those are the three things that I want to focus on today. Okay, so I want to start with just thinking about how nature, because we're going to talk about solitude in nature, how nature has come sharply into focus, perhaps over the last decade or so, but particularly I think in the last 3 to 5 years with the growth of the climate crisis movement. And some of these images I think really portray where we're up to now in terms of our focus on nature. It's really clear that we don't have to flick through our newspapers very far or listen to any radio broadcast or turn on our television sets to see that the climate crisis is straight right in front in front of us. We hear talk about the climate crisis and global warming, about plastic pollution, and how particularly in the United Kingdom, a lot of our plastic, which consumers think is being recycled, when they put it in their recycle bins, is actually being shipped out to other places in Europe and burnt. And you can see some of the images there of the damage this does. We talk about emissions when we're talking about nature and the damage to our natural environment of emissions, not only from our cars and our vans, but also from industry. And the devastating effect that all this kind of human action has on nature in terms of drought, as you can see there, in terms of extinction, loss of ocean diversity, and rainforest loss. And just to kind of mark that, I went for a few days break last week to the beautiful Lake District in the northwest of England. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's an outstanding area of natural beauty with high fells and mountains and beautiful glacial lakes. And I was really surprised and shocked to see how low some of those lakes were, and actually also to go and see what should have been an absolutely beautiful waterfall, but because of the lack of rain that we've had over the spring, there was just nothing there. And lots of people were talking about how this is the worst it's been for decades in that particular part of the world. So I think what these kind of images for me show is that nature is in focus, but it's in focus because of often our abuse of the natural world. And a part of that abuse has come about, I suppose, because we've come to see nature as some kind of commodity. And often we're not looking at nature in and of itself, we're looking for it as a commodity that we can use. We can exploit it for our different human purposes. And Stephanie Nash, who positions herself as a mindfulness coach, has talked about the different ways in which we might use nature. And she's thinking about this in a very positive sense. But when I read some of the things that she's proposing, it kind of reminds me, I think, that we are using nature in some ways as a commodity. So she talks about the importance of solitude in nature for what she calls monasticization. So we can use nature to go and be alone in it, and that helps us in some way with our physical and our mental health. She also talks about the importance of solitude in nature for self-inquiry practice, for kind of working on ourselves and working towards better versions of ourselves. But also Alison Cox and others have written about solitude in nature as therapy, about the importance of going and being in nature for therapeutic purposes, again, for our physical and mental health. And I'm sure that many of you will have seen the rise in the use of green prescribing. So doctors, general practitioners, instead of giving out medication, about advising people and actually prescribing time spent in nature for its healing properties. Now, I'm not saying that any of these things are wrong, that going and spending time alone in nature, reflecting on our own human condition in beautiful surroundings, or in spending more time out of doors rather than sat on our sofas in front of digital devices, is necessarily a bad thing. Those are good things, and I actually went and did that last week to just have a break from the screen. I was, guilty of this as well, going and spending time in nature. But is that appreciating nature itself, or is it using nature as a commodity? Well, if you're not kind of persuaded, then perhaps this will help you to think where I'm coming from. I think there are numbers of initiatives like this. And I found this very quickly just by doing a quick search on Google for kind of retreats in nature. And this came up. This is the Sharpham Trust. And the Sharpham Trust is based in Devon. And it's a business, it's run as a business, and its stated aim, its mission statement is to connect people with nature and to foster mindfulness through the arts. And you can see there that in the tabs across the top, you can see there the mindfulness retreats. There are various events that you can go to, and what you can just see in the background there, the wooden structure, is something called the Kuki, where if you really want solitude in nature, you can go there, pay quite a substantial amount of money, and you can have your solo retreat in nature for the week, and you will see nobody else. Food is brought to a secure location where you go and pick it up from, and you see nobody else. And actually, you don't have to search far for these kind of initiatives. There's an awful lot of people making money out of the business of solitude. I just thought I'd share these couple of quotes with you, which really summarise that just kind of introductory things I wanted to say about solitude, nature, and utility. And this is from Leah Nail and Ofra Meiseles, who say this: numerous studies and personal accounts in the field underscore the solo experience as one of the most significant nature-based interventions, and it's linked to various beneficial outcomes. These studies emphasize the significance of the wilderness, far from daily demands and devoid of technological stimuli, allowing the silence, time and space for self-reflection, on the sacredness and meaning of our lives. And then also we have here another quote again from their same paper, which says the solo experience viewed as enacting these ancient rituals in modern form may serve as an antidote to the loneliness, stress and depression on the rise in the current era, which have been linked to our overly stimulated urban environments and lifestyles. So you can see there that what they are advocating is the beneficial outcomes, the antidote that comes to our modern lives of this solo experience and experiencing this actually in the wild. Sorry, I seem to have lost my ability to move the presentation on.
You should open.
Oh, there we go. Apologies. So yeah, it seems that getting away from it all and getting away from everyone is something which is now widely practiced and widely valorized as being something hugely beneficial to our mental and our physical health. And often it's these kind of solo experiences in the wilderness are justified in terms of linking us back to our ancient traditions and our primeval past in some way, that this is not something new, this is something really ancient. And so Naora Maiseli say this: the ancient tradition of wilderness solitude, revived in the current age as the wilderness solo experience, may provide individuals with a path to practice the gift of silence. So here there are not only benefits advocated in terms of our mental health, our physical health, but also something akin to our spiritual, our emotional health, something that reconnects us with our ancient roots. Now, all of that I think is really interesting in terms of particularly the growth in the industry of solitude and the industry of solitude in nature. But what I want to do is think a little bit differently about solitude as just kind of being alone in nature. I want to disrupt that kind of thinking. And to do that, I turn, as the title of the presentation suggests, to these two thinkers. So on the left, you have Henry David Thoreau. That's a very iconic image of Thoreau, which you see everywhere, and indeed is on the front of the latest wonderful biography of Thoreau. And on the right, you see Anna Shepherd, known commonly as Nan Shepherd. So if you've not come across these thinkers, let me just say a little bit about them. So on the left, Henry David Thoreau, American naturalist, town surveyor, philosopher, poet. He was also a very political figure in the anti-slavery movement. Most famously spent a night in jail for not paying his poll tax because he thought it would go towards the Mexican War. So a pacifist in many ways. And he lived in Concord in Massachusetts, about a mile from the famous Walden Pond. And he was part of a group of intellectuals, together with Louisa May Alcott, Ralph Waldo Emerson, who is his friend, and Nathaniel Hawthorne, the author of The Scarlet Letter. So they were really a group together who popularized the transcendentalist kind of way of living and transcendentalist philosophy and ideas. And I want to draw today really on perhaps Thoreau's most celebrated work, Walden, which is his account of 2 years that he spent living on the shores of Walden Pond on his friend Emerson's land, and just what happened there. But of course, the book is much richer than that. It's sociological, it's philosophical, it's political, but essentially it's a story of his life of 2 years, kind of condensed into one at Walden Pond. Nan Shepherd, on the other hand, much more contemporary figure, died in 1981. Thoreau was born in 1817, died in 1862. Nan Shepherd, born in 1893, died in 1981, and spent much of her life in Aberdeen, in and around Aberdeen. She was an educator, she was a teacher, latterly at the University of Aberdeen. And she was an author. She wrote 2 or 3 novels, which I'm just reading at the moment, and she wrote a couple of volumes of poetry. But she's best known for a book which apparently was only published in 1977, but had been sat in a drawer for a couple of decades before it was published, called The Living Mountain. And it's a most beautiful, powerful, evocative little book about her life walking mainly on her own in the Cairngorm range of mountains in Scotland. So these are beautiful books. I'm going to draw very heavily on them and undertake what I think is quite a close reading of some passages from their book. So there you can see that's the 1999 edition of Thoreau's Walden on the left, and the 2011, I think, edition of Shepherd's The Living Mountain on the right. So I want to draw on both these books in the remainder of the time for this presentation. What I find in both books, though, is that there's something of a paradox going on in relation to the way that both Thoreau and Shepherd see solitude. So let me start with Thoreau then. These are some of his thoughts about solitude. Indeed, in his most famous work, Walden, chapter 5, he includes a whole chapter on the subject of solitude. And he writes in several places in the book that if he's in the town, if he's not by himself around the shores of Walden Pond or in the New England forest, where he spent lots of time walking every day because he was the town surveyor, so he had to survey and measure bounds for all his clients. So he spent a lot of time walking hundreds of miles in the New England forest for his surveying work. He says, if I'm not doing this, I feel asphyxiated. So solitude lets him breathe, but company is like to him asphyxia. And in his personal correspondence to his mother Cynthia, as in the edited collection edited by Harding and Bode back in 1958, Thoreau writes a letter to his mother Cynthia from Walden Pond. And he says this: I want a whole continent to breathe in, and a good deal of solitude and silence, such as all Wall Street cannot buy. So clearly there he's got a particular view about solitude. It's the place where he can breathe. When he's alone, he can breathe. He doesn't suffer this asphyxiation that he does when he's in the town and in company. And here's another quote from Bradford Torrey, who was the editor of Thoreau's journals. He wrote about 2 million words worth of journals, which were just his daily diary of what he was doing when he was going out, measuring bounds, and his journals record his daily life. And he draws on many of his journals then to go into some of his most famous books like Walden and A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, another of his famous volumes. And in the introduction to one of the volumes of Thoreau's journals, Bradford Torrey writes this about Thoreau. I am all without and in sight, said Montaigne, born for society and friendship. So was not Thoreau. He was all within, born for contemplation and solitude. So it's not only Thoreau saying what marks me and the way I want to live is a form of solitude. It's other people who also see that in his work, as perhaps Bradford Torres quote here demonstrates in comparing him with the essay writer Montaigne. But I think this would be to understand Thoreau in a way that's not quite right. If we see him as solely advocating solitude as his preferred mode of living. Indeed, many people, excuse me, many people have tried to argue that Thoreau is like some kind of hermit who went out to Walden Pond with his little aphorism, simplify, 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 and that's all that Thoreau is about. But when he left Concord, the small village of Concord, in spring 1845, when he was 27 and went to Walden Pond, he went onto his friend Emerson's land. And he was only a mile from Concord. And indeed, he used to take his washing home, which I think a lot of people have said, is he some kind of hypocrite? He went out to live by Walden Pond, but, he went home, saw his friend Emerson and took his washing home every week. So I think there's some paradox going on here. That's not all that Thoreau is about. Indeed, if we just look at the titles of some of the other chapters in Walden, we can see that he is profoundly interested in ideas of hospitality and what that means for him, and what it means not only to be hospitable to people, but hospitable to ideas too. So here are some of the titles of chapters in Thoreau: Visitors, Brute Neighbours, Housewarming, Former Inhabitants and Winter Visitors. So we kind of get the idea that this idea of solitude is not all that Thoreau is about. He's also interested in hospitality and in visitors. And this is perhaps one of the most famous lines from that volume, from Walden, when he says, I had 3 chairs in my house, 1 for solitude, but 2 for friendship and 3 for society. And he also says this in Walden too, I've never felt lonesome or in the least depressed by a sense of solitude. But once, I doubted if the near neighbourhood of man was not essential to a serene and healthy life. To be alone was something unpleasant. So there's 2 things going on here, isn't there? There's this longing for solitude and the need to breathe, but there's also this craving for hospitality and visitors and being exposed to otherness and other ideas and being with people. And some have said that, these differing views, show that Thoreau was some kind of hypocrite or a man who just couldn't make up his mind, was a little unhinged. But I think what these 2 different views perhaps highlight is that there is a different idea of solitude in Thoreau that is simply not to do with being in the absence of human company. And indeed, Stanley Cavell, the American philosopher who has written widely on Thoreau's work and wrote a beautiful little book just in the years just before the Vietnam War, his book, The Censors of Walden, which is a beautiful and rich reading of what he thinks Walden is. Cavell says this, that he doesn't see the drift of Walden to be arguing that we should be alone. It's rather that in Walden and for Thoreau, when we are alone, we are actually never alone. So I want to kind of play with this idea then of the paradox of solitude in Thoreau and argue that he has a very different view of solitude, which is much more rich and complex than just being in the absence of a human other. And I want to try and draw out three particular aspects of the way I think that Thoreau understands solitude, and I also want to bring in Nan Shepherd to that as well. So I want to begin with this idea of encounter. So encounter in both Thoreau and Shepherd is really about a loss of the self, or a distancing of the self from the self, which opens up a space for encounter with otherness, a meeting of radical difference in the non-human. And I think Thoreau showed us about this idea of encounter as part of his understanding of solitude when he writes Walden, because he includes in that volume so many references to other forms of cultural life and literature and history that are completely alien, to what he knew from his time in New England. So he encountered radical otherness at Walden Pond while he was alone there in his hut. And that comes out in the way that Thoreau writes his account of Walden, of his time at Walden. If you read it, it's completely littered with references to the Bhagavad Gita, to Hindu and Persian poetry, and to Celtic and Scandinavian mythology. So he was exposed, he encountered radical otherness by being alone and reading this literature from different cultures. But he also saw it in nature. When he was sat alone in nature, he encountered things and ideas and animals and the non-human in a way that for him was really important and couldn't have happened if he was in the town. So there's lots of things being tied together here: the idea of solitude, the idea of nature, the idea of radical otherness, and the idea of encounter. And I think all of those four things are encapsulated in what I think is a beautiful quote here from Walden. And just before he writes this, Thoreau is reflecting on just resting in the shade in the woods after a morning of planting crops in a clearing in the forest. And he calls this spot a very secluded and shaded one, where he encountered other things, the animals, nature, in what he called a mode of encounter. And he says this: "You only need to sit still long enough in some attractive spot in the woods that all its inhabitants may exhibit themselves to you by turns. You only need to sit still long enough in some attractive spot in the woods that all its inhabitants may exhibit themselves to you by turns." So there's something in this idea of encounter which I think is also related to a Heideggerian idea of aletheia, or unconcealing or revealing. That idea of encounter is really related to this idea of revealing, and it's when we are alone in nature that perhaps is the axiomatic time when this kind of encounter can happen. But it's not only encounter that I think is important in this idea of solitude in Thoreau. I think it's also an idea of communion, and I find this very strongly resonates in the work of Nan Shepherd. And for Nan Shepherd, it is through communion with nature that actually brings other things into presence. for us. And she says it especially brings our own relationship to nature into presence, our communion with nature. I think it's easy when you read Nan Shepherd's work to be completely bowled over by the beauty and the persistence of her language. If you've read her book, and I would really advocate you're reading it if you haven't, it's astonishingly beautiful. It's visceral and seductive and deep and rich in its descriptions. But I think it says something about what it means to commune with others in nature, and also what it means to commune with nature herself. And there's something in Shepherd, I think, which is about the way she describes it when she's walking. Sometimes she walked alone, but sometimes she's walking with companions. But I just want to use this as an example of the way that she writes about the companions with whom she walks. So let me just read these two quotes to you. I first saw it on a cloudless day of early July. We had started at dawn, crossed Cairn Gorm about 9 o'clock and made our way down to the saddle to the lower end of the loch. I motioned to my companion, who was a step behind, and she came. I waded slowly back into the shallow water. There was nothing that seemed worth saying. My spirit was as naked as my body. It was one of the most defenseless moments of my life. Now, just looking at those two short extracts, what stands out for me is the way that Shepherd moves seamlessly between the pronouns I and we. She starts off with I, and then she drops in we, then she goes back to I. And she talks about her companion, my companion. But that companion is never named. We know nothing about the companion. So this seems to me interesting, because what, for me, it highlights is the fact that for Shepherd, the communion that she experienced in nature isn't communion with a human other, with her companion, of whom we know nothing at all. It's about her communion with nature, and it's about her communion in one sense with herself. But when she is wading into that shallow water, nothing matters than the water itself. And she goes on to describe the feeling of the water and the way her feet went numb in the coldness of the water. So it was one of the most defenseless moments of her life, because she was utterly in the power of nature here. So I think that idea of solitude as enacting or enabling or bringing into presence a kind of communion with nature is not only there in Shepherd, I think it's also there in Thoreau too. Sorry, I'm having problems moving on the PowerPoint again. I think it's definitely there in Thoreau too. And he writes this, and this is again from Walden. I find it wholesome to be alone the greater part of time. To be in company, even with the best, is soon wearisome and dissipating. I love to be alone. I never found the companion that was so companionable as solitude. We are for the most part more lonely when we go abroad among men than when we stay in our chambers. So for Thoreau, it's solitude with which he is in communion, in terms of he's in communion with himself and he's in communion with nature, in the same way that Shepherd is. I'll wait for the bells.
Oh, apologies.
I think it's absolutely beautiful. It gives me time to think. So I think these ideas of encounter, and particularly communion with solitude and communion with nature, I think profoundly disrupt any idea that we can just escape to nature as a way of realizing a need to be alone and achieve solitariness. But I think there's something else as well. So the third aspect of solitude that I find in Thoreau and in Shepard is this idea of revealing. We've already seen how Thoreau writes about sitting in a quiet, shady spot and things revealing themselves, exposing themselves to us. But for both Thoreau and Shepard, to experience such encounter and communion requires a shift in perspective that reveals things to us. And there's a lovely passage in Shepard about this. And this is not just a metaphorical shift, by the way, or a literary shift. This is an actual physical shift for Shepard. So she writes of going on a walk one day to see Loch Corrie of the Loch. I think that's a beautiful name for a piece of water, Loch Corrie of the Loch in the Cairngorms. So it's a piece of water on a hill that she knows very, very well. She knows it intimately. But she goes there one day and she lies down level with the water. And just that changing of the focus of her eye reveals something to her, not only about the colour of the water and the shape of the mountain towering above Loch Corrie, but it also reveals something to her about herself and her place in the universe and her tininess against this huge mountain. And she says this changing of focus in the eye, moving the eye itself when looking at things that do not move, deepens one's sense of outer reality. By so simple a matter too, as altering the position of one's head, a different kind of world may be made to appear. I think that's absolutely glorious, that example. And I've tried to choose a photograph which is taken from that ground level to just try and kind of expose and reveal what Shepard is trying to say here, that the shifting of our perspective reveals something of the world to us. And it's important for her that she's alone when this happens, and that sense of revealing, of learning something about her sense and something about her own sense of self and the sense of place of where she is can be made to appear by this kind of solitary encounter, communion, revealing in nature. But I think also there's an equally beautiful example of this in Thoreau. And this is actually not from Walden. This is from a short essay he wrote on walking, just called Walking. Just going back to a little bit of background, Thoreau was the town surveyor for Concord. So you know, if you now visit the visitor centre at Walden Pond in Concord in Massachusetts, you can actually see there some of Thoreau's very primitive measuring instruments. You know, his plumb line on his piece of string and his measuring instruments that he used to go and measure his bounds. So he used to measure out fields and wood plots and all sorts of things for the townsfolk of Concord. And actually, if you read his journals, he didn't like the work very much. He liked the walking in nature, but he often thought that, you know, he had to make a living and surveying was the way he made his living. But actually, it wasn't what he really wanted to do. He wanted to be alone at Walden Pond writing. You know, he had aspirations to be a poet and an essayist and a lecturer. But he had to do this work. And this is just, he went out one day, as he reflects in this essay, Walking, he went out one day into the New England countryside. And in the distance, he sees another surveyor with his client, and they're staring down into an old post hole. And they're clearly getting very agitated over where the boundary is. And Thoreau just reflects and thinks, what on earth are they doing? And he says this, and I always get emotional when I read this because I think it's beautiful. The worldly miser, the client, was with a surveyor looking after his bounds while heaven had taken place around him, and he did not see the angels going to and fro, but was looking for an old post hole in the midst of paradise. So there's Thoreau saying, actually, when you are alone in nature, look at what can be revealed to you. The whole of heaven can be revealed to you. You can see angels going to and fro. Don't just stare into an old post hole when you're in the middle of paradise. And for me, that says something quite profound about the solitary experience in nature and the revealing that can come from it. Julian, am I okay for time? Because I've just got a final slide. Is that okay?
Yeah, I think a final slide, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Good.
So the final slide, kind of towards solitude then. So, you know, how can we achieve or bring to pass or bring into presence this kind of solitude of which Thoreau and Shepard, I think, so beautifully and eloquently write in their works, this kind of solitude which is not just the absence of a human other, but is a solitude which is marked by encounters and exposures, is marked by communion, and is marked by kind of revealing. How can we do that in the busyness of our everyday lives? And one might think, if you know, cynically, well, you know, it's all right for Thoreau and Shepard, isn't it? You know, Thoreau lived in rural, underdeveloped New England. In fact, it's not that much the same. Sorry, not that much different now. If you go to a New England, you know, maybe fewer trees, but you know, the national park is glorious in around there. So you know, it's all right for Thoreau to write about this kind of beautiful engagement with nature. And it's all right for Shepard living in the Cairngorms with the Cairngorms on her doorsteps. How do we achieve that, that kind of communion, that kind of revealing, that kind of encounter when we live in cities like the one in the top picture above? Well, I think there's some answers both in Shepard and in Thoreau for this. I don't think that either of them would argue that this kind of solitude can only be achieved in the Cairngorms or at Walden Pond. Because to achieve that kind of solitude, or to experience that kind of solitude, requires simply an attentive engagement with our world. Whether it's those green spaces, those few trees that you could see there just on the shoreline, or whether it's in a beautiful forest in the Lake District, like where I was last week, or if it's in some other national park. Doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have acres and acres of exposed space. You can experience this kind of solitude through an attentive engagement with our natural world, wherever it is. If I turned my camera around to you now, onto my table, you can see that I've got an array of potted plants. I won't, because I'm not a very good plant mother. Some of them are a little bit brown, but sometimes I think I can achieve that kind of solitude just by simply turning my attention, as Shepard just turned her head physically to look at Loch Corrie of the Loch. I can achieve something of that solitude by being with nature, with my plants on my table, if that doesn't sound a little bit strange. And I think Thoreau and Shepard would say that it is through just that entanglement with our environment that even in the busiest of our lives we can achieve that kind of solitude in nature. But what it does require is a bringing of the very ordinary into presence through a shifting of our perspectives. And that's where I want to leave it, I think, and maybe we can open it up for discussion. That far from thinking that solitude in nature is something that we have to go and buy, returning to the opening slides of the presentation, we have to go on and have that kind of experience which is managed for us, or that we have to go and do this in some vast expanse of nature. We can do this, we can achieve this, just through our attentive engagement with the word, our entanglement with our environment, and bringing the ordinary into presence through shifting our perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Let me see. Oh yes, I found the applause icon as well.
Thank you.
The wonders of Teams. It would be lovely to have some questions, discussion and so on. Perhaps it would be appropriate to have just a minute or so for people to think first about if they have questions and comments.
Thank you.
Rather than rushing in. So I will shut up. It's the hardest lesson I've ever learned, is how to be quiet myself. Which is related to what you're talking about, Amanda. So let's have a couple of minutes and then see if people have questions. That's wonderful. If you would like to ask a question, and I see Piotr has already put a hand up, an electronic hand up. If you can put your hand up. I don't think we've got the chat facility on this particular system. So if you put your hand up, if you remember, of course, to unmute yourself, and if you're willing, turn the camera on as well. But I see Piotr Domoraci has his hand up. Piotr, would you like to ask or comment?
Yeah, I would like, with pleasure, Julian. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, I would like to thank Professor Amanda Fulford for her unusually interesting lecture, bringing us closer to nature, which is particularly topical in the context of summer holidays, which are often spent in nature. Thank you also for reminding us of the quite well-known figure of Henry Thoreau, and the less known, at least to me, Anna Shepard. The descriptions of vivid contact with nature in both Thoreau and I hope Shepard are remarkably picturesque. Many thoughts and associations and feelings are evoked by these images, but there is no time to comment, so I will stop with a question. According to you, Professor, can we say, in the spirit of Thoreau, that there is no qualitative difference between human contact with other people and human contact with nature? And the second question after it, if I may, is it possible to talk about loneliness in contact with nature at all? As is evident from Thoreau's descriptions, The natural environment provides for man not only a background or a frame for his or her life, but it allows us to enter into relationships with the nature. And the last thing I would like to ask, would you agree with the statement that solitude is usually perceived in anthropocentric categories? Mm-hmm. It is the lack of presence of another human being, the loss of human ties with him or her, that makes us feel lonely. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, the humanization or personalization of nature known from Thoreau's text causes and gives hope that the loss of relations with other people can be cured by contact with nature. However, a doubt arises whether turning away from nature does not threaten loneliness. Thank you in advance for your answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Piotr. I mean, such lovely questions. So thank you for engaging, you know, with the presentation. Perhaps I can take the questions in reverse order, if that's okay. So you asked if I would agree that the way that solitude tends to be framed is in anthropocentric terms. I think that's how I understood your question. Yeah. And I would say yes. If you you know, if you go and ask, you know, the average you know, woman or man on the street and say, you know, what does solitude mean? They'll say, well, it means being without, you know, being without anybody else, anybody else. Mm-hmm. So I think that that certainly the way within Western culture, I'm not so sure that it's the same perhaps in other Eastern cultures, I'm not sure, but that solitude is absolutely seen in anthropocentric terms. And I think that's what I was trying to get at in this presentation, that I see that Shepard and Thoreau disrupt any idea of that, and that you know, they turn away and say, actually, one can be alone as a human being, but one is never alone, as Stanley Cavell, I think I referred to in my presentation, points out, because when we are in nature, we are with others, other non-humans. So yes, I absolutely agree that that we think of it in terms of, you know, anthropocentric senses, but I think that's unhelpful, and I think that it's certainly exposed in Shepard and Thoreau, who actually talks about the mountain as she, which is interesting. When she goes to I think it's Ben Macdrewy is the name of one of the mountains. And that she talks about you know, living with the mountain and getting to know the mountain as one might get to know a human being. And she, you know, something quite epistemological about Shepard's work, because she talks about what it is to know the mountain, coming to know the mountain. And I think for her, that is more than just knowing the route to the summit. It's not about knowing the route so that you don't slip and break your ankle, and knowing the best path to take that's not going to get your boots muddy. She's not talking about knowing the mountain in that sense. She's talking about knowing the mountain as one might know a human. And she says it takes a lifetime to know the mountain. So yes, I hope that answers that question. In relation to your other question, I think I took it down right. You said, can we talk about loneliness in terms of contact with nature at all? That's a really interesting question. I'm going to try and answer it in a way that I'm kind of working out what I think as I'm saying it. So once I've said it, I might disagree with myself, but bear with me. I think some of the problems of our human relationships, as a number of thinkers and philosophers have tried to point out, is the way that we tend to objectify the other person. So obviously Martin Buber, in his I, it and I, thou kind of distinction, has drawn attention to this. And in other ways, the French existentialist philosopher Gabriel Marcel, in whom I've become interested, has written in these terms too, and also Levinas, surely. So maybe that's maybe loneliness between humans is in somehow related to the way that we tend to objectify the other. But I think for Thoreau and for Shepherd, I think they would say that we can't objectify nature in that way. And therefore, it isn't possible to be lonely in nature. I hope that somehow goes towards answering your question. I'm still thinking about whether I believe that, but that was what came to mind, first of all, in relation to that. And can we say that that in Thoreau there's no qualitative difference between human contact and contact with nature? Goodness, that's a huge question. I suppose it's something I'd like to go away and think about, but no, I think he would say there is a qualitative difference, but I'm struggling to articulate at the moment what that might be. I think he would say that we encounter the human in a different way, and that we encounter nature in a different way, and so our contact with them is different. But maybe it's the idea of hospitality that there's a difference, that we are differently hospitable to humans than we are with in nature. And I think part of that comes from the way in which we're kind of bound to be hospitable to human others as human beings, but we're not necessarily bound to be hospitable to nature, but we are. I'm sorry, that's very fuzzy thinking at the moment. Yes, I think there is a qualitative difference. I think it's to do with the nature of encounter and something to do with hospitality, but I think I'd need more time to actually kind of articulate what that is, Piotr. So I'm sorry, that's a very unsatisfactory answer to that part of your question.
Yes. Thank you very much, beautifully, for your co-thinking and interesting response.
I'd just like to ask you, if that's okay, do you think there's a qualitative difference?
It's hard to say just at the moment, because we need probably make a long distance discussion about that.
Yes, but I'd certainly like to talk more with you about that. That's a really interesting question. Thank you for posing it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's I'm tempted to say for myself, sorry, this is a part of question, a lot of the great writers about what we call nature are writing precisely when they or the people around them feel lonely for or of nature. So Wordsworth at the beginning of the 19th century, through Thoreau in the middle, through to, I don't know, Thomas Hardy at the end of the 19th century, through to Nan Shepherd, are all feeling the penalty of urbanization, industrialization, objectification, and are responding to that aloneness from nature by trying to re-encounter and re-commune. So in that sense, I think there is a loneliness experienced of nature. Nature writing before the 19th century didn't really reflect, well, my feeling is it's a response. It's not an ancient, these are not, as some of those websites you showed suggest, recovering ancient rituals. They're recovering what we lost through urbanization, in the last
Indeed.
100 years.
I mean, just thinking through further, if I may, Julian, is that okay?
Yeah, that's why I was.
I'd be tempted to say that Thoreau thinks that actually an I-thou, to use Buber's distinction, an I-thou relationship is more possible with nature than it is with a human other. But then I think of some of the comments in his journals about what was happening, you know, with the great move west in America, and you know, he reflects in Walden about the you know, the ice cutters who come to the pond every year and destroy the, you know, the borders of the shoreline of the pond, because in their zeal to cut ice and take it to Boston for the, you know, for the cafes in Boston. And he also talks about the felling that's going on in the New England forest. And he has there's a beautiful and a very evocative passage about the cutting down of an oak tree in one of his journals. So maybe it isn't the fact that he's saying it's easier to have an I-thou relationship with nature for humans generally. I think he might be saying it for himself because of who he was. But I think he finds that still, you know, humans can have that I-it relationship with nature in terms of the objectification that's perhaps illustrated through things like the ice cutting and the tree felling.
Thank you. Are there other people who would like to ask questions, make comments? Roseanne.
Here. I think that there's I appreciate all that you have said in the presentation and the conversation we're having now. I think there's a distinction between aloneness and loneliness. And I find the aloneness to be not lonely at all.
Yeah.
And
yes.
I do wonder if that time of aloneness in nature, in a sense, sharpens the person or refines the person more fully. And one then goes to, and there's a kind of an encounter in that aloneness. And then one is more refined for the moment of encounter with another human being or a group of human beings.
Yeah.
So I find encounter to be common to both.
Yes.
And I'm reminded of the fact that in the last several weeks with the change of climate here in the eastern part of the United States, I've been spending 2 mornings a week out watering the flowers on our grounds and picking the roses. And I come in from that and I can't put it into words, but I know something very profound has happened between myself and nature and you know, all the spiritual reality that's a part of that.
Thank you. Yes, I like the distinction, Roseanne. Thank you for your question and comment. I like the distinction you make between aloneness and loneliness. And I think I want to make a similar distinction between solitude and solitariness, because I think for me, solitariness is a little, to me, has those negative connotations, whereas solitude has for me very, very positive connotations. And that solitude, as I think you said, sharpens or defines the person more fully. I really like the way you put that. It's something that in the chapter that I've written for Julian's wonderful volume and Goshia's volume, I write about disengagement as a kind of precursor to encounter. And I wonder if that's what you're thinking of when you say you know, we need to be kind of sharpened through solitude as a kind of preparation for encounter, whether that's a kind of disengagement. And I use the example in the chapter of a colleague of mine, Jan Maskelyne, from the Catholic University in Leuven in Belgium. I think a few years ago, he took a group of he took a group of masters and doctoral students to Athens on a walking, philosophy and walking kind of tour. And I think the students were a little bit disappointed because they were expecting to go and see the Acropolis and the Parthenon and the sites, and he didn't take them there. He took them just round the streets, and they walked round the same streets day after day. These poor students didn't have a clue what was going on. But it was that kind of disengagement from what was expected, going to see the Parthenon and the Acropolis, that sharpened their attention for what then they encountered and came into view. So I think I'd like to say that solitude kind of needs that disengagement to then open up those possibilities for encounter and engagement and revealing and communion, the kind of things that I talked about. So yes. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
And Dat Bao, you have a question.
Yes, I just want to share a bit of my reflection, and then I will have a bit of a question for Mandy. I think it's just, first of all, it's something new for me because most of my research is on silence, and then solitude is something that I recently begin to read after I've talked with Julian. First of all, it's a beautiful presentation, Mandy. I just absolutely enjoy it.
Oh, thank you.
I like the way you conclude your talk when you said, just when we turn our attention to something, we kind of, to the effect of the way I understand, making choices, we see new stimulus, and we achieve a different angle on life and on work. So I like that, and certainly things came flushing back to me as my own experience. I remember a few years back, we had a group that were making a book, and we decided to have a symposium. We meet in the forest called Damai Lao in Malaysia. Wow. We all love nature. We belong to the C group. That there's a website of the C group, and we've been writing poetry for years, but we're also academics, so we love nature. And we met together in the forest for the symposium. We got together and we listened to each other's presentation. Then we got the stimulus from each person, and then we withdrew back to our room to write in solitude. Now that when I recollect that, I call it solitude. And when I went back to my room, I had more ideas compared to before I met. And I talked with a colleague named Alan Melly, and he said he felt the same way. Without the stimulus from a bit of interaction, he couldn't draw from his own thinking. And that experience, when I think about when you spark up the interest in me to reflect, remind me of the idea of structure. You know, when I research on silence, every person's silence different in terms of lots of things which I can capture in a term in structure. And I think Thoreau and Nan Shepherd have their own structure in expressing their solitude. Like when you said hospitable, the hospitable self in Thoreau, he expressed to nature and he expressed to a friend. That's his way of expressing solitude. And for Nan Shepherd, she expressed solitude through time to get to know the mountain, for her appreciation and attentiveness. That's her way of expressing. And so I'm curious about yourself too, Mandy. Maybe you can share an experience of how you shape your way of expressing solitude, your structure of solitude, how you use it, even sharing a moment of how that affects your academic work or philosophy. That would be lovely to hear too. Yep.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Perhaps I want to share my own experience through, I think, going back to something that Jan Maskelyne writes about in his paper when he talks about taking the students to Athens, because these students do experience this kind of solitude on their walks, but the way that they do it is through having what Jan Maskelyne calls inattentive attention. That I think sometimes there's a risk that comes with those kind of very organized solitude, tours that or experiences that, you have to have a structure, you have to have a routine. At 10 o'clock you should do this, and then you must spend, an hour in meditation here, and it's highly structured experience of kind of solitude in nature. But I think what I do, and I think what Thoreau does, is what Jan Maskernen calls inattentive attention. As we saw on the quotation, Thoreau just went out and sat in a shady spot in the woods, and things revealed themselves to him. So he wasn't concentrating on anything. He wasn't sat there thinking, right, I've got half an hour before my next meeting. I'm going to have a bit of solitude time and trying to focus. And that to me doesn't work. Those kind of managed experiences of solitude. For me, it's those kind of moments when actually I am focusing my attention in another way, but inattentively. So I'm not directing it. That for me is I think what Thoreau was getting at, and I think is what opens up the possibilities for the kind of encounter, the kind of communion, the kind of revealing that I've spoken about. So for me, I try not to structure. And if I do, I think what I'm trying to do is inattentive attention.
Yep. Thank you very much. It's a very lovely response. Back to my reflection, it's not like actually what I meant was not about planning your solitude and desire it in a way that we like, but after some time when we remove ourselves from the experience, we
Yes.
look back and we realize there's a sense of movement.
Okay.
Metacognitively later on, we
Yes.
look back and
Right.
realize,
Okay.
like music, when someone write music, the inspiration came, and
Yes.
then the song just appear. And then later on, if they analyze the process, they see
Right.
the structure of thinking, but it doesn't mean we pre-plan
I see. Yeah.
our.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay,
But that
thank
was
you.
a lovely answer that I really liked. Yep.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question, Andy?
Please, Julian, go ahead.
I've been interested in and Piotr Domoraci started asking about the encounter with other human beings and nature and other beings. And sometimes I feel as though only seeing being in encounter when one is with other human beings is a sort of narcissism. But then, of course, the story of Narcissus is of a person who stares at a lake surface and sees his own reflection and gets turned into a Narcissus plant, or the myth of Narcissus. So one can use, and is this what you would think, some of those commercial engagement with nature are actually narcissistic,
Yes.
as in the original Narcissus tale?
Absolutely, because I think what we get in Shepherd and Thoreau is an opening up, a seeing things differently, a physical movement of the head and the eye to see things differently. It's an opening up. But actually, I've done quite a lot of looking at these, these very highly structured, managed experiences in nature, and they are all about closing down. So it's about closing down other stimuli, but also in one sense closing yourself down. So this focus on the self and the recentering of the self in nature. So if you look at the Sharpham Trust, for example, they will say, well, at 8 a.m. is breakfast, and then you must do this, then you must have an hour of this, then you do this, and it kind of closes down any possibilities. You must go for this walk along this path, and it should take you 20 minutes, then you come back and do this. And I suppose that's partially what they're selling, isn't it? An experience. But to me, it closes down possibilities, and it manages them in a way that that kind of communion and encounter and revealing just isn't possible, because that's all to do with opening up.
Indeed. Thank you. Wow. I think these are discussions that will continue. Thank you so much, everybody. This was I think a good, what I would call peaceful, I don't mean everyone agreed, but a genuine conversation and not a competitive question fest.
Indeed, thank you.
Which I appreciated, and that's both in your responses, Mandy, and in the questions themselves. It's been wonderful, and I want to go for a walk now.
Oh, well,
nature.
Can I just say thank you again to everybody for giving up your time. I think this is such a rich area of thinking and philosophy and research, and I'm just so privileged to be involved. And thank you to everybody for your really interesting questions, the ones where I couldn't really answer and I will go away and think about, but I'd love to be in touch with you and to join you at some of these other meetings in the future. That would be great.
Thank you so much. Our next seminar is in October with Helen Lees, who is now based in Italy, who is a specialist on silence, but on everything.
Wonderful, and I hope to be able to join you then.